Now, rarely does a simple childlike faith ever settle so firmly in one's soul and reorient the entire world to its coordinates. That's my summation of Hudson Taylor. Rarely does a simple childlike faith ever firmly settle in a soul and reorient the entire world. Because in that moment, Hudson Taylor didn't just get converted, but the entire world had changed. Everything was different. He took God at his word. He never flinched when the world or mankind or circumstances are contradicted. In fact, he had this cute phrasing. He used to call the Bible, or maybe you've heard people call the Bible different things. Maybe you've heard the Bible a book of promises, a book of grace. Hudson Taylor just called it his book of certainties. Everything was certain. There's never any question. There's never any doubt. There's never any shadow of turning. God said it. It was true. And it didn't matter what anyone else or even circumstances said. One biographer accurately summarized Taylor this way. He said, Hudson Taylor was engaged in a race of time against eternity. He was now converted. And there was one thought that now dominated everything he thought. And that was the grace of God shed abroad in his heart needed conveyance to the unreached. How will they otherwise call upon the name of the Lord if someone does not go and communicate? He was possessed by the unignorable reality that hell is real. God's justice makes it so. And the Chinese people in particular living without hope, and hell was opening its mouth to swallow 250,000 every single week. Now, once Hudson Taylor's heart was set on Christ, his heart was tuned to Christ's missionary cause. He decided he needed to start preparing for the field right away. You read a lot of biographies of missionaries. They have a pretty profound conversion experience. And then often they have a pretty profound experience of being called to the mission field. But for Hudson Taylor, those experiences were deeply blended together. As soon as he knew that he was converted and God's grace was his, he turned his sights toward China. He decided he needed to start living in preparation of the field. Now, this is where the life of Hudson Taylor, it becomes biography worthy. Because up until this point, these stories are great, they're fine, they're cute, they're interesting. But this is not why people know Hudson Taylor. They know Hudson Taylor because the moment he gets converted, he decides that the only true book is the Bible, and it is only by the Bible that he's going to live. So he starts living in a very mean way. He decides he's going to enroll in medical training. So he goes and works with a surgeon. Back in those days, it was still an apprenticeship type relationship. These days, things have evolved dramatically. He starts living with these surgeons and these doctors to learn, but he would never tell them that he needed a salary. He would never do that. Now, his boss said, I recognize you need to be paid, so remind me when you need to get paid and I'll give you money. But Hudson Taylor said, well, if I need to trust God in China, I need to trust God here. I'm not going to tell a single soul. And he didn't. If you ever read his life, there's just story after story of miraculous intervention, almost always at the last minute. You almost it's strange, you almost get used to it when you're reading the biography. You're sort of like, oh, that happens all the time. But then you kind of snap out of it, right? And you realize, wait a minute, this stuff's happening to this guy, him, all the time because of the faith with which he apprehends God's good promises. So there's one story where he's destitute, no money for food, no money for rent. And he's very concerned because his landlady, he just rents a little room in her apartment, is an elderly lady. She's a widow. She's really poor. She has no money for food. If he doesn't pay rent, she starves. And so he's praying to God, I'm never going to ask for money, but if you could tell people to give me money, that would be good because I need to give my landlady her rent and then she can eat. And the story is he walks into his surgeon boss's room, his office at night. It's Saturday afternoon, right? There's no more postage. The banks are closed. And he's desperate. He's starving. He needs money to buy food and to pay his landlady. And then out of nowhere, his boss says to him, Taylor, you never told me that your salary was due. I told you to remind me. And in that moment, Hudson Taylor, he records this in his journal. His spirit just lifted like, oh, thank you, Lord, for reminding him. But no sooner did his spirit lift than it dropped. Because then his boss said, well, I've already sent all the money to be deposited in the bank. I've got nothing to give you. If you'd reminded me like 20 minutes earlier, I could have given, but unfortunately you didn't, and so you're fresh out of luck. And Hudson Taylor's like, Lord, are you mocking me? Like why does he remember at all if he remembers too late? So Hudson Taylor's too ashamed to go home because he's got nothing to give his landlady, not just no money, he has no explanation for why he has no money. So he stays in the office and he's just there praying and he's finishing up some paperwork and he's really just procrastinating the inevitable confrontation with the landlady. And at some ungodly hour at night, like 11:30 at night, his boss has already gone home next door, he's already in bed. His boss storms in the door and says, "You're not going to believe this, but someone who was meant to pay their account next week has, for some unexplainable reason, turned up now and given me the money that they owed me. So here's your salary. And here's an extra little bit of something to help you because I know that you're living in such mean circumstances." This stuff happened to Hudson Taylor all the time. Like a shocking repetition of times this stuff would happen to him. He was often giving out his money. In fact, when he was receiving a salary regularly in London, training under these surgeons, he was giving 2/3 of it away to Christian missions organizations. It was an amazing account of a life of faith. It was sort of like a George Mueller type story of how he would depend on God because he believed when he got to China, he would need God to intervene and to grant his grace. There's another interesting story. While he was in London, there's this curious moment where he finds out that a minister in town has got a copy of a book that he wants called Medhurst's China. It was like a really primitive, crude overview of the nation, the people, the culture, the language. In Hudson Taylor's own words, he said this: "I called upon him and I ventured to ask for a loan of the book. This the minister kindly gave me, inquiring why did I want to read it. I told him that God had called me to spend my life in the missionary service in China. And the minister said, 'Well, how do you propose to go there?' I answered, 'I did not at all know, but it seems to me probable that I should need to do as the 12 and the 70 in the Gospels. In Judea, they went without purse or scrip, relying on the one who had sent them to supply all that they needed.' This minister, kindly placing his hand on my shoulder, he replied, 'Ah, my boy, as you grow older, you will become wiser than that.' Such an idea would do very well in those days when Christ himself was on earth, but not now," the minister said. Hudson Taylor concluded by saying this. He wrote this some decades later. He said, "I've grown much older since then, but apparently not much wiser. I am more convinced now that if we were to take the directions of our Master and the assurance he gave to his first disciples more fully as our guide, we should find those words and those commands and those promises suited to our needs just as well as they were in the age that they were given." And this is part of the story of Hudson Taylor's life. In fact, he's famous for this phrase. Some of you, if you ever see a Hudson Taylor quote, it's likely to be this quote. It seems to be the most oft referenced phrase. It is, "God's work done in God's way shall never lack a God's supply." Those are the conditions. Is it God's work? Yes. Is it done in God's way? Yes. Then be sure God has not forgotten how to funnel funds and resources and supplies when his work needs doing. Hudson Taylor decided he would never remind anyone of the money that he needed. He never took up an offering. He preached at conferences, missionary organizations. He never asked for a single donation. And this is how his life began, in the missionary service.